Hearing no objection, it is so decided.
The beginning of the end for oil and gas? Welcome to the show. Well, after 2 tetchy weeks of talks in Dubai, the world came together to herald the end of the era of fossil fuels. But will it be enough or fast enough? We'll have a look at the deal and how it unfolded. Also on the show, with carbon offsets like tree planting getting a bad name, I've been looking at one company using the cash to decarbonise social housing and reduce residents' bills. As the government cans the hydrogen heating trial in Redcar, is that the death knell for hydrogen in our homes? And we've been up to the Dales, to the wettest part of Yorkshire, to learn how restoring woodlands can stop flooding downstream. But let's start in Dubai, which has been hosting the COP28 United Nations Climate Summit, which came to an end this week with an agreement to move away from fossil fuels, to transition away. Well, Sky News' man who's been following it throughout the time is our science editor, Tom Clarke. Tom, how do you think this UAE consensus, as I think it's been called, will be judged?
Well, they are calling it historic. So how is it historic? Well, it is fair to say it's the first document, if you can believe it, in this whole 30-year UN process to actually mention the words fossil fuels and the need to get rid of them in some way. Here it's a transition away from. Those words are very carefully chosen, by the way, but it's the first time that it's been mentioned. So in the context of this process, it is a very historic agreement. Before that, it was impossible to get that kind of wording in there because there was always a country, and this whole summit process relies on unanimous agreement. There was always a country or a group of countries, usually those who are dependent on fossil fuels or dependent on selling fossil fuels to the rest of the world, who'd block it. And somehow at this summit, they got round that and they managed to get that wording in. That makes it super, super significant, but there are a lot of caveats.
And just on that, you know, the countries who are reliant on fossil fuels, it is quite a big deal, even if it's just moving away, not phasing out, to say, you know, that thing that supports most of your economy, that is a bad thing from which we should shift as a global economy. That's quite a big deal in terms of sort of, you know, global geography and geopolitics, isn't it?
Absolutely. And you look at what people were thinking on the way into this summit, a lot of people saying, how can we expect any significant progress on a climate deal in a country that is entirely, you know, whose economy is built on oil? The guy chairing the meeting is the CEO of an oil company. Lots of speculation in the media about, you know, the connections, dodgy deals, how this wasn't going to work. Also, very close allies with OPEC, with big oil producers. Yet they kept telling us throughout, maybe we'll be able to pull something off that the traditional process hasn't. And I think it's fair to say, in terms of the wording, that's what they've pulled off, and that is quite surprising.
Tom Clarke there. Well, to find out a little bit more about how this agreement was achieved and what it will actually do in practice, I'm joined by someone else who was there throughout. That's Tom Evans from E3G. Yes, a lot of Toms in the show. Welcome. Yeah, how was this achieved? It started off people saying, you know, this is a climate meeting in a petrostate, not a lot of optimism. Something came out at the end. How was it done?
Well, I think the critical factor here were the small island states, the countries who were on the front line of the climate crisis. And these countries were the first ones to say, we really now need to acknowledge the problem. It's fossil fuels. It's the source of the climate crisis. It's the reason we're in this mess. The key players there were, in addition to the small island states, a coalition of Latin American countries, the likes of Colombia and Chile, and also some of the European countries, especially the EU, who together adopted a strong position on phasing out fossil fuels.
It's interesting you mentioned that the small island states as being part of what contributed to this deal, because in the immediate days after the deal was announced, there's been some unhappiness from them that it hasn't gone far enough. So how do those two things fit together?
Well, they had a very high ambition ask coming in, the full phase out of fossil fuels. The text that was agreed talks about transitioning away from fossil fuels. It's not quite as strong. It doesn't give the really strong push in the direction of actually definitive and concrete action to eliminate fossil fuels. But they are understandably disappointed that that's not gone far enough. But at the same time, it's a negotiation between over 190 countries. And it's very hard to get everyone to agree to the most ambitious things.
And you mentioned this power bloc that came together to really be very, very insistent on fossil fuels being in there in some form, preferably as tough as possible. Does that in the end actually affect Saudi Arabia and Russia? Is there some, I'm just intrigued to know what the kind of mechanism is that actually pushes them to think, okay, I have to put my pen to this?
I think this is a really long-term game. A country like Russia or Saudi Arabia or any oil exporting and producing country isn't going to turn off the taps on fossil fuels overnight. They need time to transition. They need a bit of a pathway over the few years ahead to be able to say, okay, we're slowly transitioning our economy towards clean and green. But what this does do is it indicates that direction of travel. Back in the Paris Agreement, we talked about trying to limit warming to 1.5. And in the 8 years since, we've seen country after country commit to net zero targets, which align with a trajectory to do that.
What role or influence did the UK have in this? There's been a lot of talk about how domestically we've moved away from some of our climate ambitions, and that maybe has inhibited our power overseas. What did that feel like in the room?
The team on the ground, the officials and the diplomats are very well regarded, but what we're missing are the political leaders and the politicians and the ministers who are really giving them the full force of their direction. What they are really hampered by is that weak domestic position where they are pursuing a policy of expanding oil and gas. They're pursuing a policy which is turning back on green policies. And that's not really helping them when they're trying to sit down with a country like Saudi Arabia and say, you need to follow us. And the Saudis can immediately come back and say, hang on a minute, you have to walk the talk. So it's not helping. But I think what we've seen here again can be a tool to go back to the UK government and say, this is something that you've agreed internationally. Now, what are you going to do to implement it?
Thank you, Tom Evans from E3G. Now, as we've heard there, the absolute focus is on cutting real emissions, carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases. But we won't get there immediately. So a lot of people in the meantime are saying we should use what are called carbon offsets. While companies still emit, they pay for carbon dioxide to be absorbed elsewhere. Often in the past this has involved trees, but I've been to Norfolk to see a scheme that involves social housing. What's going on here is a world first. Polluting companies are paying for a low-carbon domestic makeover. Harrison lives here with his mum and two cats. Close to you here?
Yes.
So how does it feel living here?
It feels a lot more warmer and comfortable than the place I used to live at.
Their whole home has been decarbonised, so now it's not only more environmentally friendly, but helping with the cost of living too.
We had a pay-as-you-go meter, so I feel like at times my mum was sort of consciously looking at the meter to see how much she got left and sort of trying to budget her way around it.
So here you're spending less, but the house?
It's all efficient, it's cheaper. Like I say, it's a lot better for the environment.
So how's this comfort been achieved? Well, solar panels on the roof coupled with an air source heat pump. A new electric boiler to work alongside the heat pump and solar panels. The floor has been replaced and it's much better insulated. And in the loft, absolutely loads of insulation and a battery up there for the solar panels. And finished off with new doors. Total cost around £60,000. And yes, that is a lot of money, but it's not been paid for by Harrison and his mum or the Housing Association. So who has paid? The bill's been covered by carbon credits, a way for companies to offset their climate pollution.
This is a tool which can help address both climate change and the twin crisis of fuel poverty in this country. We're the only scheme globally that is originating carbon credits from the decarbonisation of homes.
But one of the questions is whether carbon offsets can truly pay for additional work. In this case, how can the company be sure these green refits wouldn't have happened anyway? Simon says the job is so big, it'll need this extra money.
Decarbonising our homes is the single biggest challenge the UK faces towards achieving net zero. It is work that is expected to cost in the order of £500 billion across the UK's housing stock. Government is able to contribute in the single-digit billions, and so there is a significant gap that private capital needs to come forward and fill.
Given that more than 13% of adults in England are living in fuel poverty, it's something housing associations are more than happy to have help with. How important is it having the carbon offsetting money for this?
Oh, it's hugely important because it means we're able to do the properties as a whole property approach.
And how does it feel to be able to do this?
Fantastic, because you're talking to the residents and you see what benefit is given to them, and to see them excited about the fact that their smart meters are now a lot lower.
And there's more to come. Saffron plan on retrofitting another 434 homes, lowering their tenants' bills and their carbon footprint. So, just to recap, this story is about companies who do pollute, who do emit carbon dioxide, paying to have those emissions absorbed or offset elsewhere. But how do we know that is actually happening with these projects? That's where this lot come in. They are a carbon ratings agency.
We are looking at a project in the Brazilian Amazon that's aiming to avoid deforestation.
And what are these lines here I can just make out?
So what you're seeing here is previous deforestation events that occur, and that's the difference in the color.
B0 Carbon assesses the quality of more traditional carbon offsetting, like protecting forests, renewable energy projects and restoring mangroves or peatlands.
We think that there is a whole spectrum of quality of credits within the market. And at B0, we have an 8-point scale to define how quality could be. This ranges anywhere from a D to a AAA.
And a AAA means, in this case?
The highest quality.
Right, so the most robust. This is definitely helping to fight climate change.
That's exactly right.
And how robustly do you sort of keep an eye on these projects?
So once we rate a project, we actually look at it for its entire lifetime. This can be anywhere from 10 years to 30 or more years.
But carbon markets have a mixed reputation, accused in many cases of ignoring the wishes of indigenous people, overestimating their offsetting quantities, or failing to replace trees lost to forest fires. But the central criticism is that they give companies an excuse, a way out from actually cutting their own emissions, in effect buying the right to pollute. You firmly believe you're helping to fight climate change, you're not just giving companies an excuse to carry on polluting.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I often say here is, what is climate action? And for us, climate action is not stopping traffic in the middle of a road, it's voting with your skills. We have people here from academic, from forestry, from marine biology, from industrial sciences, people from finance, people from data science, software engineering, all coming together to say, I am using my skills on a daily basis. The prize is trillions of dollars investing in biodiversity, climate outcomes that can not only restore and preserve the natural world, but also create an economic model which sustains it in the future.
But these refit projects prove that carbon offsets can pay for more than protecting nature's home. They can also improve where we live. And that might make offsetting more trusted and more popular. Well, while trees are often talked about in that carbon offsetting world, after the break we'll take you to a soggy corner of Yorkshire where they're being used as a tool for flood prevention. Welcome back to the show. Now, a couple of weeks ago we covered growing local opposition to a planned trial for using hydrogen gas to heat homes in Redcar in Yorkshire. The government has now announced that the trial will not go ahead, casting doubt on whether hydrogen will ever be used to heat our homes and further cementing government policy behind heat pumps instead. Gas networks and boiler manufacturers have been lobbying hard for hydrogen to have a role in home heating. The Energy and Utilities Alliance is a trade association that represents many of them.
The people who think this is the end of hydrogen for heating are frankly wrong. We've always expected new build to be a suitable place for heat pumps to go en masse into homes that are built specifically with a heat pump in mind. Whereas retrofitting a home, getting rid of their natural gas usage, is an obvious place to move to for hydrogen, because the choice that people will have to make is they can't use natural gas in the future. So you either have a hydrogen boiler or you have an expensive heat pump. That's the choice that people are going to have to make in the next few years.
Well, a hydrogen expert who's been a vocal critic of this trial is Professor David Seaborn from Cambridge University. And David, you've been up to Redcar itself. How do you greet this news?
I think the government has really done the right thing. It's great that they've followed the scientific advice on this one. There's been overwhelming scientific evidence about hydrogen really not being suitable for heating homes. I hope that other countries around the world will see what's happened here and how bad hydrogen is for heating and how the UK has veered right away from it. And I hope that they will see the light and follow the UK's lead.
Well, the government statement claimed that they did it in effect because of a shortage of supply of hydrogen. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm a bit sceptical about that one, but I can see that the government is in a difficult position. There's a lot of strong interests in this trial, and they need to make a brave face of it, and that's as good a reason as any.
Right. So why do you think it's inappropriate for the home?
Well, there are a number of reasons why hydrogen really doesn't work for home heating. The number one reason is that it's incredibly expensive, and however you make it, whether you make it from electricity by green hydrogen or you make it from blue hydrogen, from natural gas, it's just much more expensive than existing gas heating. The other thing is it really doesn't help us with the environmental problem. If you make it use green hydrogen, there's an eye-watering amount of renewable electricity needed. So much renewable electricity that the country would really be struggling to meet all its other decarbonisation targets.
Officially, the news today is this is just trial over. They're leaving the door open for it, in theory at least, for it to be used as a home heating energy source in the future. If you had to put money on it, do you think we will ever see it in homes?
I think it's very difficult to see it in homes. You know, there's been over 50 independent reports, scientific reports, that have said that hydrogen really is not going to work in the home. There are much better alternatives, and particularly heat pumps and heat networks, which are way more efficient and cheaper.
Well, you mentioned heat pumps, but it was quite apparent, we heard from some of the people in Redcar, that they weren't exactly pro-heat pumps, they were pro-gas. They wanted to stay where they are with this. So haven't we got a bit of a problem that people aren't ready to move to a low-carbon heating solution?
Well, I'm sure that's absolutely right, but that doesn't mean that we should try one which really isn't going to work. You know, what we have to do is to work out how best to make heat pumps and heat networks attractive to UK customers, to get over the high capital costs and take advantage of the low running costs.
You say that, but at the moment electricity is really expensive. That's another thing that makes heat pumps hard to swallow.
Well, it does, but the overall balance of economics is in favour, certainly, of heat pumps. I think one of the biggest problems for the government is to convert 30 million houses into low-carbon heating. But the right thing to do is heat pumps and heat networks, and absolutely not to have way higher prices that you would get with hydrogen.
And just as a thought about where the government is, it seems to me they haven't actually killed hydrogen for home heating, but they're kind of letting it die.
I suspect it will die, and we'll see what happens in the next election.
Well, thanks very much indeed, David. Now, Snaysholme in Yorkshire has nearly 3 times the amount of rainfall as here in London, making it the ideal place to test out the idea of planting trees to reduce flooding downstream. Our very own Mickey Carroll has been up there getting her feet wet.
In the Yorkshire Dales above a town called Hawes, winter has arrived. By the time spring comes, this hillside will be covered in the shoots of new residents.
So this is one of the young trees that we've planted here on site. And it doesn't look like much now, but given enough time, this will kind of grow into a fully healthy sapling.
Discreetly planted all around are tens of thousands of saplings that will grow into one of England's biggest new native woodlands. In a few years, this entire area will be a patchwork of trees, peat bogs, grassland and heathers. But while that might all sound idyllic, this project isn't about restoring beautiful landscapes. It's about stopping flooding in the valley below.
So we're in Snaysholme, it's a valley in North Yorkshire. It's one of the wettest places in England. Receives about 2 metres of rain each year. A lot of that falls in these really big winter storms that we get. And that causes big problems for people living downstream. There's big flood risk. And unfortunately, we know with climate change, those are going to get even more frequent and even more extreme in the future.
It takes about 2 days for heavy rain on the tops to turn into flooding in York. But for the people at the bottom of this hillside, the effect is more immediate. Within a day of heavy rain on the tops, Jill's ice cream shop is usually forced to close.
It used to be perhaps once or twice a year, probably sort of March and November, but this year in particular, we've had 4 floods already.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
That's why there's scientists up in the hills. They're measuring how quickly new woodlands can reduce flooding.
So as the surface of the water goes up and down, we'll know that change.
The experiments they're starting now will run for 20 years. It's the biggest piece of scientific research ever undertaken on English uplands. Dom and Robin are installing pressure gauges in the streams.
It measures the amount of water that is coming off this valley and into the stream, into the river rather, that is then going down and affecting areas further downstream, which will give us an idea of how that ebbs and flows over the seasons, and in years to come how the forest or the trees that are being planted will affect those data readings.
Woodland soils let the water more quickly into the soil, so during really heavy rain events that water gets into the soil rather than running off the land, and that contributes to reducing that peak flood event for downstream communities.
So in the grassland here we can see this lovely stag's horn fungus.
And it's not just the streams that are getting poked and prodded.
When we have a system like this, which is full of beautiful mosses and grasses and sedges, we have a certain kind of diversity. When we bring in trees, there's also going to be different plants, so different sort of types of plants. And that's really important because in the face of things like climate change, when you have a greater diversity, it's possible that you also have more resilience to climate extremes.
In September, the government announced £25 million of funding for projects that use nature to increase our resilience to flooding. The experiments happening here on the tops of the Dales should prove that that is money well spent. Nikki Carroll, Sky News.
Well, that's it for this week. Remember, you can catch up on all your climate and environment news on the Sky News website and app, or by scanning the QR code that's on your screen right now. We'll be back next week for our Christmas special, where we'll be looking at some of the highs, the lows, and even the ho-ho-hos of the last year. Bet you can't wait.